Thanks everybody for coming out this afternoon, taking your Saturday summer afternoon to spend here at the Pratt Museum. I'm going to stand over here, so you'll hear my voice more than you'll see me, but that's okay. And we are here to talk about cosmology in the Catskills and cultural and ceremonial landscapes and what that all means. And you know, probably everybody in this room has walked through the woods around here. If you walk through the woods, you're going to come across unusual things made of stone, whether it's an old cellar hole or an old wall, foundation, piles of stones, all kinds of interesting things in the woods made of stone. And if you walk around, eventually you're going to see them. Everybody does, and they fall into many different categories. Something that's cultural and not ceremonial might be something like millstones or quarries, because there's not really a ceremonial purpose. That's more industrial, and there's a lot of that in our area. But we're not really going to focus on that so much. We're going to think more about these in a ceremonial and a Native American cultural context. It's interesting to note there was a survey done, part of the 1880 census in the US, that documented stone fences in the Northeast, specifically in New England. So it didn't really count New York, but they discovered and documented over 240,000 miles of stone walls just in New England. And if you think about that, that's a very large number. That's, it reaches to the moon, or it wraps around the Earth 10 times, 240,000 miles of stone walls. So the question becomes, could those have all been built in the short window of time since Europeans arrived on our continent? Just a few hundred years before 1880, and nobody was there. I think we'll postpone this. How about that? Oh, and I said 10 minutes. Next time it comes up in 10 minutes, I'll say an hour. So I was lucky enough to serve 2 terms as vice president of NERA, the New England Antiquities Research Association, which Todd over there is now the New York State coordinator. There was a period of time where there was an absentee. And New England, or the Northeast Antiquities Research Association, is just that. It's all the states in the Northeast. A group of avocational researchers go into the woods and record these things and compile a database. And they have 2 conferences a year, and they publish in a journal. And NERA is a good thing to get into if you are interested in this kind of stuff. So, why isn't it advancing when I hit the button? That's kind of odd. But we'll just start from the beginning again. So, I always like to reference Doug Harris. He's a wonderful gentleman who was the former Narragansett Indian Tribe of Rhode Island Tribal Historic Preservation Office. He was the deputy officer for over 20 years, and he is recovering now in a hospital outside of Boston from serious condition. And I always want to say good thoughts and good energy towards Doug. And Doug, he brought this term, "let the landscape speak," from the ancestors forward, and really said these things are self-evident to Native Americans, and even if they're not fully accepted, which they're not by archaeologists and historians in the Northeast, the tribal community has certainly recognized them, and we're going to discuss that a little bit. And I think it's really important to start out with a type of acknowledgement towards the Native American community. My daughter, who is 18, says, "Dad, you're not Native American. How can you talk about them in a presentation?" But I tell her, if you do it responsibly and respectfully and by giving proper recognition and credit where it's due, that's important. And where we send our kids to school, and where we mail our mail from, and where we shop, and where we do our business, is all on lands that were taken, in many cases, without the permission of the native population that was here before Europeans. So it's important to recognize that forced removal and that dispossession, and to make an effort to make up for that by collaborating on the study and protection and promotion of that cultural heritage. So they would refer to these mysterious stone piles in the woods as Manitou Ashanel, which is the Algonquin local colloquial way for saying spirit stones. If you were in Narragansett or further east, eastern Algonquin would be something more like Manitou Hasanesh. But we're in the Catskills, so we'll go with the local Munsee pronunciation. And a lot of the work that I show is really building on the work of these two gentlemen, James Mavor and Byron Dix, in their book Manitou. And just the concept of a native civilization, in some cases, riles some historians and academics because they'll say there was no civilization here before Europeans arrived. And of course, we know that's not true. And these folks, these two gentlemen, who were not lightweights, and they were both NERA members early on. Mavor on the left was a naval architect at Woods Hole. Very respected gentleman, and Byron Dix was an optics engineer at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And these guys really made the case that the natives built in stone in the Northeast. And that's not taught in the textbooks. They may discuss fish weirs a little bit, but to say that there were ceremonial constructions, it's not recognized. Although we're doing better in building a case, and that's part of what NERA is about. I bought a book years ago about Atlantis by Ignatius Donnelly, and when I opened the cover, these two clips were inside. It's like finding gold when you buy a used book, and inside are old paper clippings, and these are from the New York Times in 1967. It's hard to read, but down on the bottom left is James Mavor from Woods Hole, and he's directing the excavations at Santorini in the Mediterranean that were linked to Atlantis. And this is the New York Times. Here's the Science Sunday section of the New York Times in 1967, July, talking about shedding new light on this old mystery. And, you know, these days, talking about Atlantis in any serious fashion gets you ridiculed. You know, look at Graham Hancock and his series on Netflix, Ancient Apocalypse. He took a lot of heat for just suggesting that there might have been a precursor civilization to the one that we know about. So we're going to look closely at archaeoastronomy, landscape archaeology. This is something that goes on worldwide. We see examples of it, such as Stonehenge in the upper left, Malta, the Mandahar temple there, which is a solar calendar. Chilquilco on the bottom left in Peru is a solar calendar also with the 12 mounds marking the solstice extremes and the equinox. And on the bottom right, you actually have a chamber in Putnam County, New York, a megalithic chamber that's aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth here about archaeoastronomy. And really, it's the study of how ancient people studied the sky and used what they observed to inform their worldview and belief system. And if a landscape represents a living synthesis between the land and its people, the people who inhabit it, then we can think of a skyscape as a landscape that includes a portion of the horizon or the sky from which cultural stories can be constructed. So elements of the sky world, including the sun, the moon, the stars, the Milky Way, served a purpose and held meaning, connecting the celestial world above and the plane of the living through stories and actions and community and spirituality. As above, so below. The sky was the ancestor and the teacher leading the way to eternity. We have some charts here. We're going to look at them a little closer as we go into it. We have some examples on the left that we already talked about. Here's a closer look at the Putnam County Chamber on the solstice morning, shortest day of the year. And there was a wonderful gentleman named Enrique Ngora who for years led groups of people to these chambers in the pre-dawn hours of the winter solstice and documented on Super 8 film those solstice sunrises and the alignments shooting these light daggers into the entrance. Very purposeful, and there's hundreds of chambers in Putnam County, and many of them have this alignment either to the solstice or to the equinox. Of course, this is a tradition that is carried on in many other areas of the world. This is Gary David's book, The Orion Zone, which documented how the Hopi, the ancestral Anasazi, migrated their habitation zones along these solstice paths and these azimuths that indicate where the sun rises and sets on the shortest and longest days of the year. So over many generations, they migrated and moved their encampments, and this is basically showing where the archaeology is of their encampments or their habitation zones. Even when we look at our nation's capital. And David Overson wrote a great book called The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, where he documented that many of the streets and avenues were laid out to solstice and equinox alignments. And of course, Washington was designed in the Masonic tradition by Freemasons. So they had a tradition of archaeoastronomy going back to, well, literally the mystery schools of the Egyptians. So another book I always like to point out is The New View Over Atlantis, which made a wonderful case for these types of alignments and constructions in England, all over Great Britain, and how many of the churches were built on much older pagan sites, and the locations were chosen because of the alignments to astronomical events. The United Southern and Eastern Tribes recognized in 2007 through resolution what these are, what their meaning is. For thousands of years before immigration of Europeans, the medicine people of the Uset tribes used these sacred landscapes to sustain people's reliance on Mother Nature and spirit energies of balance and harmony. And whether these stone structures are massive or small structures, stacked stone rows or effigies, these prayers in stone are often mistaken by archaeologists and state historic preservation officers as the efforts of farm clearing, stones for agriculture, wall building purposes. So that, that is the case for many of the things we see, but it's not the case for everything. And that's the problem. None of this is in the textbooks. Right now in university, they use Herbert Kraft's book in many classes on Native American studies, and he got it wrong. He says there's absolutely no proof that man-made megaliths or dolmens, with or without grave objects, or any other manifestations of old world funerary constructions or astronomical alignments exist in the Lenape lands or in the Northeast, and the burden of proof is on those who make such claims. So this is over 20 years old. It's out of date. It's dogma that needs to be rewritten, and hopefully the next version of textbooks will have the right information in it. Going towards that and speaking to that, this is an event that took place in 2014, almost 10 years ago now, at Colgate University, not too far from here, up 28. Let's postpone this till tomorrow. Well, at least 4 hours. Okay. A wonderful conference that I attended, as did many of the NERA folks, that was hosted by Tony Avini, Anthony Avini, who's really America's premier archaeoastronomer, works out of Colgate and other universities, and Lori Rush. And Lori is she works for the Army up in Fort Drum in the Adirondacks. And they had a project up there where they found, and it's hard to see here, but there are stones in that picture, aligned with the sun. And they found a site up there that they didn't know what it was, and they had a construction project going on. So they went to Lori Rush, who's the cultural resource manager for Fort Drum and works for the Army. And she did her due diligence and said, we're not going to destroy these before we find out what they are. And she brought in tribal preservation office experts who confirmed that it was a ceremonial landscape, and they mitigated and left it so it wouldn't be disturbed. But it was such an important find that they reported it to Anthony Avini at Colgate, and he had no idea that there was anything like this in New York. All his work on archaeoastronomy was in Central America, Mesoamerica, places where it's been well accepted and documented for years. It's never been questioned, but in the Northeast it has been questioned. So this conference was kind of a watershed moment because it brought together academics from Colgate and other universities. It brought together folks from the regulatory community, the Fish and Wildlife, the Parks and Recreation, Forest Service, National Park Service. They all had representatives at this conference, and they also had Native American representation, the folks from the tribal community. And they held it at Colgate, and they have what's there called the Tung Ho Visualization Center, which is actually a very high-tech planetarium that's all computer generated and computer graphics, and you sit in these plush seats and you look up at this dome, and they can create stories out of the events that took place in the past. So that's really what they took place in.
Where is that? You said again?
That's at Colgate University.
Do you know where on Fort Drum? I grew up near Fort Drum.
I don't know specifically. They kept that pretty classified because it was on the Army. But they had a fence project. They were putting a perimeter fence, I believe, around a new health care building. And in kind of surveying where that fence was going to go, they came across these stone mounds and reported them, luckily. So they didn't know what they were, and they started researching, going to websites like NERA, which shows examples of these and has resources for experts. So my approach, we're going to kind of dive into some of these sites in our area. I have a GIS approach where I record sites, their specific locations and features, and that allows you to sort and filter and look for certain patterns, basically, of concentration and distribution in the landscape. And one of the patterns we see, well, here we see the sites in the Catskill on the west side, some in the Shawangunk as well. And then you see the concentration of chambers down in Putnam County in northern Westchester, southern Dutchess, hundreds of chambers there, dozens of sites in the Catskills that have been documented. So what I look for is patterns, and right away I saw that some of these look to be lined up. And when I started connecting the dots, I found that many of them kind of line up with each other on this specific angle, which parallels each other in both directions. And what you're seeing here is the azimuths to the horizon that reflect the summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunset, winter solstice sunrise, and summer solstice sunset. And this chart is by Dr. Curtis Hoffman, UMass, and he has an interest in this and published a very interesting technical book called Stone Prayers, which really breaks down a lot of the information and the numbers on these sites up and down the East Coast. But he put together this chart that shows what you would expect the azimuths to be at 42 degrees north latitude, which is where we are in New York. If you were to go, say, down to Atlanta and look at alignments, you'd be 9 degrees further south, further closer to the equator. So you'd actually subtract 9 degrees from each one of these, except for the equinox on east and west, which stays the same, 90 degrees. So that was very confirming that a lot of the sites fall in this pattern. What I added here, which is a little hard to see, are the lunar cycles as well, which are 7 degrees off from the solar cycles, and they actually have a much longer period, where the solstice happens every year with a minimum and maximum of where the sun is on the horizon. For the moonrise and moonset, that's actually a 18.6 year period, and the Native Americans actually went by lunar cycles as well as solar. So this shows you in a 3D context how, from a viewing point, looking towards the horizon, where you might see monuments that align. And this is showing some of those alignments and the angles to them, and it's not just astronomical, but if you look closely, you'll see certain things like entrance from the underworld and exit from the sky world, and an exit is not an entrance, and an entrance is not an exit, and an exit is not an entrance, so they have their own bearings. And again, this is compiled by Curtis Hoffman, Peter Waxman, and Kathy Taylor. And I just combined a lot of information into this visual chart that shows what those angles are, at least for our latitude at 42 degrees. You also have to think about what's called declination, because the magnetic declination, because there's a difference between true north and magnetic north, which is about 14 or 15 degrees, depending. And it's always a little different because magnetic north wanders around. It's not always in the same place. So you have to take that into consideration and subtract that from your magnetic reading to get what the true bearing would be. We're going to start by talking about an alignment from Long Island that comes right up through our area. It's called the Hammonasset Line. It starts out at Fort Pond, out near Montauk, and it's a winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset. It's really just a summer solstice sunset alignment from Long Island through Connecticut up to our region. It starts at a large monolith in a graveyard down there at Fort Pond called Council Rock, which is where the Montauk natives met in council for many generations. And it aligns with our Devil's Tombstone right in Stony Clove on that exact bearing of what you'd expect a summer solstice sunset to be, which is about 303 degrees true, or 318 on the compass. So the Hammonasset Line was documented by a gentleman named Tom Paul, who was a NERA member who passed away a year or so ago. He from his property in Connecticut kind of went hilltop to hilltop, documenting stone features in both directions. And they fall on the line, and here you have some of his and some of mine compiled. And these are other actual burial locations on Long Island. Again, the line coming up through our area where it crosses from the Hudson River and intersects with the Catskills is actually what's known as the Wall of the Manitou, which is that I don't have my laser pointer. Todd, you didn't bring your laser pointer? It's that north-south wall. It's really the eastern escarpment, the very eastern escarpment of the Catskills as it drops down into the Hudson Valley is known historically as the Wall of the Manitou. And it's only breached by Platt Cove and Catskill Cove, which are those two arms you see going into it. So it's about 14 miles. And that this alignment comes all the way from Long Island and comes right to that wall and then to Devil's Tombstone, I think is very telling. And this is just some of the sites that have been plotted along the line as it comes into our area. Here's the Devil's Tombstone Monument, very much a Manitou stone in that it looks like a mountain or it looks like a human torso and neck. It also, you can get behind it and really line it up with the mountain in a way that it shares a very similar profile from the top of that ridge down on both sides. And where it passes through, this is kind of a close-up of where it passes right through Stony Clove, goes through Spruceton Valley, which we're going to look at in a few minutes. But there are two large stones up on Plateau Mountain that are calendar stones, very close to Devil's Tombstone. We're going to take a look at first this one, which is right on the trail, very unassuming, but it has been propped up. And in 1981, it was actually in the Nearer Journal by a local researcher named Jay Wilcox, who showed that it had numerous alignments, one of them including the 303, the true to summer solstice sunset. So if you continue up to the summit and then cross over, you come to Plateau Mountain Calendar Stone 2. This is actually the view from the summit looking northwest. But this one actually looks southeast. It's just across the summit from that view we were just looking at. And this one has a glyph that's been carved on it of the sun, and it's got an inscription beneath it. And every time I was up there, I could see the inscription, but I couldn't really make out what that inscription was. You can tell that it's quite old, it's highly lichenated. This inscription definitely predates the trail that the DEC built up there. And it's quite old. It's got a bearing of 136, which is to the southeast, and that would be very close to a winter solstice sunrise. I was up there in the winter and I brushed off the snow and it popped out for the first time in a way that I could write it down. And I recorded what it says, and it's actually Latvian, and it says the Latvian sun god Sol, N-E, which I guess means northeast. So why this is up there and who placed it there, and I don't think the meaning is lost because it's a monument to the sun god, and it's aligned to the winter solstice sunrise. So how old a tradition that is, we know that's an ancient tradition. When it was represented up here on Plateau Mountain, that's an open question, but it's a legitimate mystery. This is showing some of the other sites we're going to look at closely on the ground here, and how the hollows are part of the equation, and there's a reason for that. That's the actual Hammonasset line there. So in Woodstock, we've got quite a few of these sites that have been well documented. This is a map by David Holden, who's also a NERA member and a licensed outdoor guide. And he put the map in the center together, and I added the text and the pictures to create this infographic which documents how scattered through the woods in the upland Catskills and in Woodstock are a large number of these lithic structures that have mostly been ignored by conventional archaeologists. And we're more and more being able to understand that they're a representation of a Native American belief system and a cultural building practice, resulting in these types of constructions. And the hollows are places where, and what we're realizing is many of these are marking water sources. They are the hollows are where the springs and the streams form, because they're like natural amphitheaters, and all the water on the surface is gathered. And because of the fractured rock of the nature of the hollow, which is a big curve in the mountain, there's a lot of fractures in the bedrock that allow for water to permeate up from the aquifers and the bedwater, or the bedrock and the groundwater, to feed springs that flow into the streams, where the rainwaters are gathered, and they flow to the creeks that flow to the rivers that flow to the ocean. So it's continuity, and they very much were marking these places. And what do they look like? If you were to go up there, you're going to see Mink Hollow here, which has got dozens of these low circular stone formations, many of them on bedrock. The bedrock acts as a foundation. Many of them lined up in rows. Here you've got 3 or 4 in a row here. These are about 1 meter high, 2 meters wide. Some of them are in great shape still. Some of them have been disturbed. And there are also effigies, or in this case, what we might consider a serpent wall, which is just a wall that stretches to, in this case, a boulder that has a cairn on top of it, Manitou Hannes Ashanel, a spirit stone. And the wall, you can tell, is not agriculture. It's not an enclosure. You know, any goat or sheep would walk right over that. So not really a practical purpose, but more likely ceremonial in meaning. Here's another wall in Mink Hollow with the cairns off to the right. Hard to say if this is colonial or not, but it does point to a place on the horizon where you would expect to see the winter solstice sunrise on the shortest day of the year, though I have not been there to document that. This is also a very interesting wall that's up there that's very unique. What I like to point out to this is how it doesn't really have a Eurocentric feel to it. European stonemasons, they like to lay stone in courses, nice horizontal, lateral types of constructions where it's very neat and orderly. This is a little more haphazard, though it's no less structural. This is a very strong wall. You can see this right side of it. It's just, you know, large boulders. Many of them look like they've come from the stream because they're rounded, and just not that European looking. And it also doesn't really serve a purpose. One of the strangest features of this wall is it's not a two-sided wall. It's more like a terrace. The land comes up to it on one side, and then it drops off, and you get a whole nother level of elevation on the other side of it. So, you know, what the purpose of this is really interesting to contemplate. It goes for about 100 feet in this direction, and then about as far as you can see in that wall, it makes a dog leg and makes a bend to the right. Here you can see it's very much aligned north-south. And then right around that big tree in the middle at the top is where it bends to the right and goes for another 40 feet or so. Also in Mink Hollow, there's a cairn that had a cyst in it, an opening. It's not reading real well, it's kind of dark. But in it was a little pedestal, and on that pedestal was an oyster shell. To me, that was very telling of this being a marking of the waters that fed the Hudson, because this stream that flows out of Mink Hollow flows to Beaverkill, to the Esopus, down to the Hudson, where there were oysters and you know, fish that sustained the Native Americans, and they probably were honoring the water and the source of the water when they put this little shell on a pedestal in this cairn, which was very fascinating to find. This is just showing some of the topography. We're at Lewis Hollow, again, amphitheater. Mink Hollow, very narrow, the waters gather. Mink Hollow is interesting because one side flows down, Cooper Lake, yep. One side, although Mink Hollow doesn't flow into Cooper's Lake, it makes a sharp left and flows out to the Esopus, and it's in the Hudson watershed. But if you just go up to the top of Mink Hollow, the watershed on the other side, just like here, is the Schoharie watershed. It flows to a whole nother river in a whole nother direction, but it's just a few miles apart. And I think watersheds were an important part of ancient peoples and the Native American cosmology. They understood their territories not by the way we do, where we divide, you know, one state is on one side of the river and the other state is on the other side of the river. They would never think in those terms because it's one watershed. So the territory would be connected to that watershed. Move over to Silver Hollow, which Again, has walls that are built aligned north and south and east and west. This one is really a puzzler. We call these mega walls because these walls are really big. That's a 6-foot staff right there. It's a 10-foot wall. Some of those boulders high up in the wall are probably 400 pounds. So yeah, quite large, and also very wide. It's not your typical wall in its width or its construction. It also has this beautiful, graceful curve to it. This is an east-west wall that's curving into a north-south wall. And also associated with the site are cairns, or these conical stone piles that are dry stacked, also much larger than what you see in Mink Hollow. These are 20 feet across and 12 feet tall, and there's about a dozen of them. And here you can see a tool and app that shows you the direction, and it's documenting this as a east-west wall. And you can see the areas that are mapped out. I don't know, I don't think my cursor will show up there now, but you can see where it's curved, and you can see where these large kind of bulbous constructions were made within the wall. And on the right, you can see where the cairns are. You can see a curved wall up there, almost like serpentine. And I'm going to just draw your attention to almost a circle of cairns on the right of the wall on the far right. And using LiDAR, you can actually see these walls. This is the Ulster County LiDAR map. You can see them faintly, north-south walls. And you can also see the ring of cairns. They're almost dead center, just south of dead center. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and some other features that are cut off. But when I looked at the LiDAR map, I started noticing little piles of stone off to the east, and you can see 2 of them in this feature. Again, I wish I had my pointer, but I think you can see where they are. And Mink Hollow is just over there. So there's like a line of these things coming from Mink Hollow in a straight line. And if you look to the very left, you can see that circle of cairns where the line is in Silver Hollow. So it's almost like a pathway from the one to the other with these mounds in the woods. And also in Silver Hollow, very similar to the mound in Mink Hollow, is one with a little cavity or cyst in it. It is oriented to the sunrise. There was nothing in it in a pedestal. We're going to now look at Bearsville Hollow in Woodstock. These are, we call turtle cairns, and you'll see why in a moment. This is just its location. Many people interpret these as turtle effigies. You can see a head tucked in there, another stone that could represent the head, another one. So all the cairns in Bearsville seem to have this representation of a turtle. There's another one with its head tucked in. And we shouldn't really be surprised to find turtle effigies associated with Native American sites. These 2 look like they're crawling right to you. Of course, turtles are very much part of the Native American cultural belief system. Almost every creation myth of every Native American tribe involves a turtle and a flood and a clump of land that's taken up from the bottom of the water and placed on the back of the turtle, either by a muskrat or a beaver or some animal. And then that process is repeated over and over until you have what is known as Turtle Island, the place where people can live. So this is very ubiquitous in the creation stories of tribes all across the nation. There's only a few that don't have that, Hopi being one of them, because they came from the stars, which is another interesting aspect. And all of these cairns and turtle effigies in Manitou, Asenel, in Bearsville are built around this stone that's in the center of it all. And I think that's why they chose this location to build all those turtle cairns, because this, and this is, you know, I'm not saying this was manipulated, I just think this was there. And as the native people came into the territory, they would survey the land and find out anything that would fit in with their belief system, anything that they could, for lack of a better word, exploit to express their beliefs and their worldview. And if turtles were important and they came across something like this, it would have meaning, and I think it would become a impetus to create a ceremonial or a stone site, and that's what I think we have going on there. And we see these turtle cairns in other sites, not just Bearsville. We see them in Connecticut. You see them right up the road in Spruceton Valley, which is one of the sites we're going to look at next. We also see serpents, another very common theme represented in the underworld. And I think what's important to point out is that you have these three elements in the native, and in many ancient cultures' worldviews, you have a three-dimensional aspect to it. We don't really think about things these days, but the sky world was connected to the plane of the living on the earth where we are, and the underworld was also connected. And there were beings and powers that existed in the sky world and in the underworld that through shamanic practices, they would, ancient cultures, including Native Americans, contact and communicate with for the benefit of the tribe, or for medicinal reasons, or to make sure things went the right way in both of those worlds, because the energies could interact. This is Halcott Mountain, beautiful waterfall there. Above the waterfall, dozens of these cairns. My pooch Smudge there, who unfortunately passed away last year. It's always good to see him though. His spirit is at these sites because he's been to many of them. And again, just these beautiful stone piles in the woods, many of them built on foundations that allow them to really stand the test of time. If they're built straight on the ground, you have actions like thaw and freeze cycle, frost heaves, things that will make it so that they won't last. But this one is obviously marking a spring coming up right from underneath it. There's a whole hillside here up on Halcott that water comes out and down, and you can see all that green lush. It's like a carpet of green coming down that hill where the cairns are. To the left of it, it's all brown, and to the right of it, it's all brown. But where the springs are and where the cairns are marking the water coming up. This large serpentine wall is also up there. This is a double wall that's been filled with rubble in between. So technically a mega wall, because it's not just a single wall, quite wide. Also, you're seeing this, this is kind of looking down it. You can see there's two walls that have been filled. And it also does not have that European look to it. This just looks a little more haphazard, and what I would say falls in the category of pre-colonial construction. Also up in Halcott, taken in the winter, this beautiful serpentine wall. Now, the stream that flows out of Halcott and that waterfall, that's the Bushnell Kill. And it flows down through Bushnellville. So it's actually the Bushnellville Kill. It's a mouthful. Kill, of course, means stream or creek in Dutch. But that flows to the Esopus and flows to the Hudson. But if you go right up the road from Halcott into Spruceton, now you've got Westkill, and the Westkill flows to the west, and it flows to the Schoharie, and it's a whole different watershed from the Halcott. And it may actually be a boundary between the tribes, where you might have had more Mohawk and Haudenosaunee influence in the Mohawk watershed, which is the Schoharie side, and more of a Lenape and Munsee influence on the Esopus side. And these are what you find up in Spruceton Valley. They're quite large, probably twice the size as what you have in Mink Hollow. Some of them also have little cavities or cysts in the middle. Many of them resemble turtles. This is a turtle cairn in many people's eyes, with the head on the left. Another, very hard not to see turtle when somebody suggests this is a turtle. Here we can have a look inside one of them. There's a space in there that potentially an offering could have been left, but we've never found anything in any of these cairns. This one looks like it's had some damage. Can only speculate whether this was done by nature or whether in the early 20th century you might have had treasure hunters or people looking for artifacts digging through these things. I think that was a popular thing to do in the early 20th century. Late 19th century was come to these sites and try to figure them out, and part of that was an invasive destruction in some cases, which is unfortunate. Luckily this is on state land, so it's protected. Another one with a cyst or a cavity in it. And what you have in Spruceton, Spruceton in Westkill, because this wall basically parallels the stream, it runs east-west, mostly, but mostly it runs to where the sun sets in the west, which isn't actually due west except on the equinox. Very large stones on this wall. This is another beautiful wall, very similar to the one in Mink Hollow. And also the cairns, some of them are lined up that parallel that wall as well. Here's 3 in a row. And as the sun goes down on the solstice and even on the equinox, you can see it shining right up the valley. This is very low in the sky. This is actually on the longest day of the year in the summer, and you wouldn't expect to be able to see you're in the middle of the mountains up there, right? So to see the sun that low is because the entire valley is oriented towards the west, and on the longest day of the year, the sun shoots right in there. It's hard to see, but that stone mound actually has a stone on the top of it that's very angular and is lined up, pointing towards that. And if you looked at it from the side, it resembles a fish. I don't have a picture, unfortunately. I have to add that. We're now going to look at, we're back in Woodstock. Going to be starting to wrap up the tour here. This is Lewis Hollow site. Lewis Hollow up on Overlook Mountain. It's got many of these features. We just did a hike there last Sunday. A bunch of folks came out and got to see all this stuff firsthand. And this is the mountain in the fall with all its glory. Lewis Hollow is over to the right, that hollow that goes in there. There's already a lot of history in the mountain that's been documented, and as you can see, rock shelters going back 4,000 years documented up there. Bluestone quarrying, of course. There's a whole long history of people interacting with Overlook Mountain. This is kind of just a chronology of the land use having to do with first harvesting wood for tanning, and then for lumber for building, and for firewood and heat before coal was used. Lots of surveying was done up there for the land grants and the subdivisions and the sales of the land. Bluestone quarrying, tourism. You have the Overlook Mountain House. So a lot of history up there. We did ask a archaeologist at the New York State Museum to come out and do a survey of the features in Lewis Hollow, and that's what you're seeing here. GPS coordinates of the dozens and dozens of small cairns. There's 45 or 46 of them. 6 large cairns, which are the big red dots. 2 serpent effigies, which are up near the 1,500-foot level, and a couple of springs. And when we tour this site, we bring folks to see all these things. Now, when the Susan Sweeney, who was the archaeologist at the museum, sent me this GPS plot that looked like this, basically, the first thing that jumped out at me were the rows of cairns. You can see kind of crescent rows on some of the different levels. But then my friend Dave Holden said maybe the large constructions mirror a constellation in the night sky, and I was somewhat skeptical of that. But the way I investigated that was to simply mark the 8 largest objects. Everything marked there is 50 to 100 feet in length. So it's really substantial, and there's only 8 of them. So I figured, all right, let me plot those 8 and basically connect the dots in the only logical manner possible, which gives you this S formation there. And I superimposed it on the topographic map, and you can see where those 2 serpent walls are, and then it comes down and intersects with these 6 large cairns. And here's kind of what it looks like on the ground, these locations, the serpent wall up on top, the great cairns lower down on the mountain, and their designations. Serpent wall 1, there's a second wall. It's not in nearly as good a shape, but it's just about 300 feet away from it. Their tails point towards each other, their heads away. One of the great cairns. And again, these things are 60, this one's probably 80 feet in length, 12 feet tall. They have retaining walls on their downslope side. This is another one of the great cairns. This one, when we brought a tribal preservation officer from the Stockbridge Munsee, Sherry White, over a dozen years ago, her first thought when she saw this was it resembles a burial mound of our ancestors. And she was interested in getting permission from the elders to investigate this with ground penetrating radar. Unfortunately, they didn't go for that for certain reasons, but we have since investigated this and had it dated, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. This is just showing how most of them on the downslope side have a retaining wall, which I think was built to keep them in place so gravity wouldn't pull them down the mountain over time. So when I started investigating petroforms that mirrored constellations, and I plotted out these constructions and plotted them, I found that there were several other examples of these types of petroforms, and they're always a mirror image of what's in the sky. So I thought, let me flip this over and then compare it to anything that's in the northern constellation and see if there's a match. And Draco popped out as looking very similar to the configuration of what's on Overlook Mountain. In fact, when I put them side by side and reoriented them, they were actually quite close, and it was striking. And I scratched my head for hours after making this correlation and saying, how could that be? And is this possible? But when I started looking into it, it became more and more plausible. And what I found was that there are quite a few examples of not only Draco, but of other constellations being constructed in the work of ancient people on the ground. This is the temples of Angkor Wat, it turns out, were documented to be aligned with Draco in the sky. A gentleman named Herman Bender in Wisconsin showed his stickman petroforms, which mirror the human figure, but also Scorpio and Libra in the night sky. A gentleman down in Fort Mountain, Georgia, showed the Draco constellation in his wall, or one of the walls that he was aware of, and also showing Ursa Minor and Major, the Big and Little Dipper. And even the Serpent Mound in Ohio has been found to be oriented to a section of Draco. So that's all very interesting. David Johnson, another researcher who documents using dowsing the water features that are aligned below the ground with the stone features on top, identified this particular petroform in New Hampshire at a state park there. Also Great Cairns, why he's calling them GC, 7, 1, 1 through 7, and also seem to mirror the Big Dipper to some degree. If you look closely, you can see where this is on Lewis Hollow, and it's hard to see on top, but when you plug the coordinates of the Lewis Hollow site, of where that stone constructions are, the Latin long, into astronomy software like Stellarium, what shows up in the sky right above it is Draco. It's always there. It's marking the point in the sky that's known as celestial north, which is actually where the Earth's axis points to. And because the Earth is inclined and is spinning and wobbling, it's not a fixed point. So north, celestial north, migrates over time, and currently it's marked by Polaris, which is the brightest star closest to celestial north. But over great periods of time, that migrates, and we'll look a little more closely at that. This is just asking the question: is this, is this a representation of Draco? I mean, I think the evidence kind of speaks for itself. A gentleman named Mark Carlotto did a statistical analysis of how close it matches Draco and how close all these other petroforms match what's in the sky. Because for you to actually do it one-on-one and get it accurate, 100%, would be almost insane to think about. He found the one on Overlook to be 82 to 83% accurate. Actually more than the other examples. I think he found Angkor Wat and that temple complex to match 75% or 76%, and some of the other petroforms lower, but all more than 50%, which he thought was important and statistically showed that they were, in fact, trying to emulate or create an accurate depiction on the ground of what they were seeing in the sky, though they were not getting it perfectly correct. This is just talking about the mythology of Draco, because before I actually started researching, I never had heard of Draco. Certainly I was familiar with the constellations on the horizon that are associated with the zodiac, but Draco, it turns out, was really important in ancient mythology to many different cultures because of precession of the equinox and because of the change of the position of north, of celestial north. And so the ancient Chinese called it the Great Year, as did the ancient Greeks, the ancient Persians, the ancient Norse, the Celts. They all identified Draco as a serpent or a snake constellation. So to find that on Overlook, which happens to have the highest population of rattlesnakes in New York State, according to the DEC. You know, in a way, it all adds up. And this whole concept is very pre-Christian in its origins. It goes back thousands of years before the time of Christ, and you can't help wonder if this whole concept of the tree of life and the serpent wrapped around it might be a representation of the Earth's axis pointing to celestial north, and the fact that Draco is always in relationship to that point. And its change in orientation, which was not lost on ancient people in their mythology, was, you know, didn't always portend good things. Sometimes it was connected to cataclysm and disaster. And that was the reason they kept close track of it, you know, very close track of it. We're going to start wrapping up here. This is some of the science that took place up in Lewis Hollow, where in the last few years we had samples collected from below. This is non-invasive, so you don't have to deconstruct anything. You take samples of sediments and rocks from beneath and within the structures, and you collect them actually in dark conditions, so in a collection cocoon. You'll see some pictures here, and you wrap them up in opaque packaging before you take them out of the cocoon and get them ready to be shipped. And this is to understand when sunlight last shone on these samples to determine a construction date of what's above it. So it's a newer methodology. It's starting to be accepted more and more as they correlate it with carbon-14 dates and can say, okay, we have one date here and it matches up with an already date, so that's corroborative. And this is just showing the process of how it's collected very methodically. The sediments, actually, you have to leave a dosimeter in there, which is what's on the right. It has to remain buried in the collection site for a year, and then it's retrieved and sent to the lab, and they use that for calibrating the dating. It's just Dr. Feathers getting his samples. You've got a couple of researchers in that cocoon right there. This is a video. I don't know if it's going to play, but I'm just going to try to fast forward through it. Hopefully it doesn't stall the whole thing out. And it's showing that there's a tent that's set up, and then over the tent is probably about 5 tarps until the researchers inside explain that they see no light at all penetrating. And then they can start their collection technique. And this is just, again, a short video, but it's freezing, so I'm just going to forward through it. And it's just showing them coming out of the collection cocoon with their headlamps on. I thought I had a slide in here, but Dr. Feather's work was published in a journal called Quadricory Chronology, one of these technical geological journals, and it published all the dates for a couple dozen sites in the Northeast. And they were varied ranges. They went from a few thousand years BC right up to contact. And these were sites all throughout New England. And the New York site dated to 1550 for one construction and about 1690 for the second, which are kind of interesting dates because they're right on the cusp of contact. One of them is certainly before contact, and one of them is, you know, a few decades after after Hudson's first sailed up the river. This is a group from the Ramapo Lenape who come up and use the site for ceremony, and we were up there on a winter solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunrise, and they did their ceremony. A couple of videos here, I'm just going to fast forward through. This is the altar that they identified as a portal to the underworld, and you can see 2 vertical stones there that have been filled in between. This is a feature that is found throughout New England and is described as Native Americans as a way to create balance between the worlds, the underworld and the world of the living, is to regulate the energy that comes through by blocking or impeding some of these portals. So yeah, that's Chief Vincent Mann of the Ramapo in the back there. And, you know, 10 degrees, they started it without any matches or lighters in a traditional method. They laid out their accoutrements here, that it was for ceremony. I was very honored to be part of this. And this was a little after sunrise when we were up there, but you could see the sun in that position. If we were earlier, it would have been very much aligned with that stone and multi-generational. 2 more sites to look at. One is here down on the Hudson, or near the Hudson called Turtle Rock, which is in Plattekill. It's got this beautiful turtle effigy rock shelter, which is mind-blowing. A lot of other features up there representing turtles. Again, we already talked about turtles being an important effigy. It's hard to say whether this was manipulated by people or whether this was an act of nature, but there is very much a equinox alignment here, where on the equinox sunset to the west, you get caught right behind the head of the turtle. You can see it there. The light is captured in a little grotto. I think that's very telling. There are other inscriptions there. Here's some more light daggers. What you have going on here is actually a shadow that's cast, and you see a 90-degree angle there, and it moves into that position where the sun is gathered at sunset. And it's literally pointing the way. You know, it's like pointing. This is where the sun will set, but this is at noon. You get this high shadow. So really interesting. Right behind the head, again, these two inscriptions. People see two carved circles here with tails leading away. That has been interpreted by some to be a cometary event or something falling from the sky. And you can see it there. The material was removed. It looks very circular. And you see them on the top of the panel, and what do you see below it? Some people see a human with their hands raised above their head and an animal off to the right. I don't have my pointer, but I don't know if you can see those or not. The dark marks, somebody with their arms, two legs, yeah, and to the right of them, an animal in profile. So whether this is an attempt to document something that happened, a falling from the sky, maybe related to the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago, when comets were known to have broken up in the atmosphere and changed the megafauna and changed the environment, and dramatically in a very quick period. That's all well documented by scientists. This could be a representation of it. There's a cross-hatching here, which some people associate with timekeeping. Not right at those were all at the turtle effigy itself, but in the vicinity of that, there's some ridges and ridge tops and other things, including what some see as a sun glyph here, a circle with rays emanating from it. There are portals that are aligned to, you can get behind this thing and look through it, and the sun will come through it on certain days of the year associated with equinoxes and solstices. There's another very interesting portal there. And if you line these up with the compass, they do line up with that chart I showed earlier, indicating exits and entrances to the underworld and the sky world. That's actually Chief Man's wife, Michelina. She's the
entrances and exits to the actual physical.
These would not be actual physical exits or entrances. These would be metaphorical for the purpose of ceremony or understanding how the energy of the earth and the sky interact.
Like a magnetic.
Well, this is again showing not the magnetic, but the true bearings of where these would be, entrances and exits. And they are close to those solstice alignments, but not exactly. And that has to do with the dates of the year. Another potential turtle effigy, yet another one. These are all up on Turtle Rock Ridge on Marlborough Mountain in Plattekill. And that's actually to the left. And what we're going to look at is the last site, which is Danskammer Point, which is right on the Hudson that you can see that point of land that's sticking out. So Turtle Rock, about 4 miles due west of the mouth of the Wappingers Creek. Danskammer Point, where the big power station is now, once called the Devil's Dance Chamber, in Dutch, the Duval Danskammer, but it translates to Devil's Dance Chamber. It's still called Danskammer Point to this day. And you can see it's got a relationship, I believe, with the mouth of the Wappingers Creek. It's called Danskammer because when Hudson sailed up the river in 1609, his crew saw a large gathering of natives at night dancing around fires doing ceremony, September 9th. Could have been the early corn ceremony. But it's why that point was very special to them and why they used it, because it's aligned with the mouth of the creek. So from the point on the summer, on the solstice, if you're looking at the creek, from where those natives were doing their ceremony, when Hudson sailed by and decided to call it Devil's Dance Chamber because, being a good Puritan Dutchman, he assumed that they were practicing devil worship, which is what most Dutch considered the Native Americans to do, and why so many areas around here are called Devil's This or Devil's That. Devil's Kitchen, Devil's Tombstone, Devil's Acre. These are all clues that this was a Native American ceremonial sacred spot. So using Google Earth, you can actually put these dates in and put these angles in, and you see that from Dan's camera, on the summer solstice, the sun rises right over the mouth of the creek there. And in the evening of the summer solstice, you have the Pleiades rise, which is very interesting. And Todd and I just saw a presentation the other day on Newport Tower in Rhode Island that also has an alignment with Pleiades rising. It's chasing the moonrise, but I'm very curious to ask the researchers who put on that presentation about whether the summer solstice sunrise conjunction with the Pleiades rise that evening is also something documented at Newport Tower. I suspect it might be. So a researcher named Gary Urton, who works at Harvard University, or he worked there till several years ago, and he wrote many books, and he was considered a brilliant archaeoastronomer. He looked at this work and he said, if you have that alignment, you want to look at the mouth of the creek over the point, because you'll have a reciprocal alignment on the winter solstice sunset. So this is from the mouth of the creek over the point, and you see that on the winter solstice, the sun sets lined up with the mouth of the creek and the point. And then in the evening of the same night, and Urton documented this as well, he said you'll have a galactic alignment where the Milky Way comes down and vertically aligns with where the sun set on the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. So that was very confirming. Unfortunately, Urton lost his job at Harvard as the chair of the department because he had inappropriate relations with a student. And it doesn't diminish his work. He's best known for interpreting the Incan knots on tapestry as being a language, which some people know about. But he had to look at this and he said there's a lot of validity to what I'm documenting here. And again, it's not me or him, it's the evidence that kind of speaks for itself. You've got these alignments, it's very objective, and I think it explains why the natives saw Dan's Camera Point in a way as a very much a focal point of their ceremony, and probably why they were there when Hudson sailed by. So here we have a new paradigm that's emerging. Dr. Romain, he endorsed my book. He's got this actually on the back cover, I believe this is there. And he's just talking about how it's clear that the Northeast has been totally and inappropriately marginalized by the mainstream and academic, and that the Northeast is right up there with all these other cultures and all these other traditions in terms of these types of alignments and the sensitivity. And it's important that it's recognized. These are the folks who did the presentation on Newport Tower. They're all NERA members and use this wonderful type of technology that is using LiDAR scanning and GIS pinpoint geolocating, and then feeding it all into an astronomy program that allows you to view the sky and the skyscape and figure things out in the context of time. Also would like to mention Overlook Mountain Center, a nonprofit that supports this kind of research, and we do hikes to these different sites throughout the year. NERA will be having a conference coming up this fall. Not exactly sure. Any idea what the location is yet?
It's Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, yep. Yeah. I want to say Westboro. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, or maybe Marlboro, or one of those boroughs in north of Boston. So if you're interested in this stuff, they have a wonderful conference. Bring in the experts, scientific and non, to break this stuff down. My publisher would be upset if I didn't mention my books. So there's Spirits in Stone. My previous books, which really are essays exploring research into the evolution of human consciousness, civilization, and technology. A lot of contributing authors from researchers around the world. I'll just mention there's an event going on at Menla in October, 1st through 4th, called the Esoterica America Retreat and Tour, and talk about a lot of these subjects, as well as things like goddess and fertility culture, Freemasonry, Knights Templars, archaeoacoustics. So if you're interested in that, Menla has information. And I think that's it. So thank you. And if people have questions, I'm happy to try to answer questions. Yes, sir.
Are these stone constructs repeated in the Adirondacks further north?
Well, on Fort Drum, yes. I mean, I haven't done extensive research up there. There are folks who do concentrate. He's a gentleman who might have access to resources. There's stuff along the Mohawk. In the heart of the Adirondacks, I wouldn't rule it out. I would say it's most likely. It's just, I can't tell you I can point to evidence other than on Fort Drum.
So you say that there are other things along the Mohawk River? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, Glenville, there's a town up there that I went up, and there's a gentleman up there who, on a preserve, documented dozens of features that are very similar, fall into the same category of patterns. And there are other researchers I should mention as well as Laurie Rush. SUNY Binghamton has a very good public archaeology department, and a woman named Nina Versace ran that for many years. She wrote a letter. She came and saw the constructions at Lewis Hollow and very much confirmed that they were what she would consider to be Native American. So we're getting there, slowly but surely. Thanks, everyone.
Question about
Yes.
the Graham Hancock's work. He did a lot of research into the antediluvial world. Since we had glaciation here,
Yes.
there's probably very little, if anything, left of any civilization prior to glaciation.
I agree as far as the evidence of it,
Right.
except
What
offshore.
That's what I was
on the continental
wondering, if
shelf
there's
is where all
any
that
research
evidence-
being done.
There is, and it's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up because the Native people, and Doug Harris in particular, started an effort with FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because they're doing a lot of offshore exploration for wind and other resources, and in doing so, the natives want them to make part, and this is the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices and groups like USET. They say, well, you're out there, you're doing these surveys, we want you to also survey for cultural evidence. And they're finding it. They're absolutely finding it. So there have been several sites located.
Is there any publication on research yet?
I'd have, very limited, but there have been some things written, including by Doug himself, on the work done, and actually the inception of it, because what happened was some fishing trawlers ended up bringing up parts of mastodons, and the mastodons showed evidence of being butchered, and actually I think one of them had a point right embedded in it. So they actually have evidence that they pulled up from, below the ocean surface off the coast of New England that indicates there were, and it stands to reason because before the end of the last ice age, the waters were 300 feet lower, and then very quickly,
175 or 200 miles.
right. And you can see the shape of the continental shelf. That was all water that was above, or a good part of it was above ground. And he talks about this in his book, Underworld.
Right.
He documents that, quite
that's fascinating.
meticulously. So I think there is evidence of that civilization. It's just below the surface of the water.
How do we find out more about the hikes that
Overlookmountain.org.
overlookmountain.org?
Right on the homepage, there's a schedule. You have to scroll down. There's a little toggle. It'll give you month by month what we have planned and the dates.
Okay.
And then you can dig in like otherwise in the programs. Sure. My pleasure. Yes, ma'am.
Your book, is it Spirits in Stone? Okay, would that book be like the book to read that was most representative of what you talked about today?
I would say it is,
Okay.
yes. Yep. Maver and Dick's book, Manitou, which I highly recommend, is much more focused on New England and on the science of documenting these things and their angles, whereas I kind of dig into a little more of the speculation, which some people appreciate and some people don't.
And do you reference that book in your book?
Yes, so very much so.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What time period do you think those rock structures were created?
That's a great question, and I want to say I think, personally, I think the very first people who came into our region, now you can debate when that was, whether it was 8, 10, 12, even 15,000 years ago, at some point, people started populating the Catskills and the Hudson Valley. I think there were people who came from the coast. And again, so this, to answer your question, I think when they first came here, they started expressing their belief system. They brought with them already beliefs that were well-founded, probably from Northwest Europe, which has a megalithic culture. And if they migrated across, as some people now think they did, because they think they not only came from the Bering, across the Bering Land Bridge, but they also came across the Atlantic, possibly earlier. And they brought traditions with them, and I think one of the traditions was fertility worship and sun worship, the two of the earliest religions of humans. So when they first started arriving, I think they looked for things that they would help express that belief and use them.
You don't think it all happened though within a certain time frame? It's spread out.
No, I
over-
think it's multi-generational,
Yeah,
thousands of years.
yeah.
Yep. I think the earliest sites probably were documented, the OSL studies, that optical stimulated luminescence study that I showed for Overlook at Lewis Hollow, was done at dozens of sites, and they got dates that went back almost 5,000 years, right up through contact. So I think it was an ongoing phenomenon.
Do you think it stopped at some point, or do you think it still goes on?
I wouldn't rule out, I know some of these sites are still used for ceremony, as we saw the Lenape using that site in Lewis Hollow. So I do think it's something that's a continuation, and I think it's one of the points that you're making that's really important is when they teach about Native Americans in our elementary schools, they talk about it as the past. They don't talk about it as the present or the future. And I do think it is, I think they're just starting to have the recognition that they're going to have in the future, and the participation, and be the stakeholders in our culture and in our communities. And we can only, benefit from it, if you ask me. They had an ancient people, and still Native tribes today have a very intimate and profound connection with the natural world that we have kind of walked away from with our technology and industrialization. So there are lessons to be learned. And it goes back to what the USET resolution talked about with balance and harmony. And if these sites are supposed to represent balance and harmony, it's balance and harmony between men and humans, but also between nature and humans. And we're certainly out of balance. And too far, when you're out of balance, you're too far to one side or the other, and in risk of falling over. So it's better to be centered and in balance. And at these sites, and I think people who go to these sites, they feel that. They commute with them and commune with them and feel that sense of balance and tranquility and awe, quite frankly. So, yes, thanks for asking that.
I'm so sorry.
All right, no, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I mention just one thing which you might have spoken about already, but since meeting you, which has got to be about 8 or 9 years ago, I discovered through your work a whole body of work that speaks about the migrations, the multiple migrations, the migrations by ocean, how some people came from South America to our west,
Yes.
and how the Bering Strait, some of those came that way, and also this theory that is swirling around about how they found some Middle Eastern artifacts, and how they feel that it was really possible that those seafaring people also came. Whether true or not is a whole
I'm a very big believer in early transoceanic voyages, that the Polynesians made it over, that the Europeans, way before the Norse and way before the Age of Discovery, were making their way over. The Templars, the Phoenicians, maybe the Romans, there's some evidence of that. It's very obscure, and it's very, this information is not accepted, and it's very frowned upon by the academic community when you try to bring these things up. But I think there's a body of evidence that they're ignoring.
I started reading it, and I started, not as a skeptic, but I keep an open mind. And what I found was there really was a strong body of evidence, and that the investment of institutions of higher learning sometimes are reactionary because so-and-so has built his or her theory on such and such, and to accept anything else is felt like a lessening of their line of work?
The dogma is so entrenched, and this is part of the issue, is trying to, kind of turn that on its end.
Right.
And it takes, they say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary amounts of evidence in this case, because there is evidence, it's just never enough to tip it, and it will eventually. And again, let's see what the next generation of textbooks.
And the ley lines and all those things.
Well, then,
I was
see,
just
once you
gonna
start
say,
getting
so
into ley lines and
fascinating.
dowsing, then people just like, their minds, the academics, they just turn and run. They don't
Oh,
want,
well, but
and it's
I thought it
unfortunate
was
because,
so compelling.
yeah, and luckily there are a lot of people who do.
Yeah, so I love that your book opened
Thank
opened
you.
me up to that.
Yeah, there is so much out there that can be challenged, and the peopling of America keeps getting pushed back and back and back. And when they were first people on this continent, as you know, 12 or 13,000 years, a decade ago, was as far back as they'd say. And now they have human footprints in white sands in New Mexico, 23,000 years old. They've got a site in Southern California, the Saturi site, I think it's called, that published papers 130,000 years ago. They're saying that humans were there making tools. So that's all, if an academic produces a paper that makes that claim, all the other academics don't gather around and support it. Their job is to gather around and be critical and try to shoot it down, which is the scientific process. But if it stands that test, then it needs to make its way into the textbooks, not just the public consciousness, because that's already there. It's getting it into the academic world and accepted. And the messenger a lot of times.
You heard about the copper mines in the Finger Lakes
Yes.
that show Minoan culture?
Yep. That's another.
Smelting operations in the Mississippi.
They think it's very possible that copper up on the upper peninsula of Wisconsin, was it the Kennesaw Peninsula?
Right.
Copper country, they call it, where this high-grade copper is just basically lying around on the ground. They think it might have fueled the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. They don't really know where all of
They
that.
found ingots in
Right.
shipwrecks
Yes.
and were able to trace the copper to those mines.
Yes, and that, again, with science, you can start to chemically nail things down. Obsidian, they can find obsidian artifacts now and do a chemical analysis and find out exactly what volcano that glass came from, specifically. So they find artifacts in the Midwest and even in Ulster County that are obsidian that came from Oregon. So,
Where?
Oregon. And these are artifacts that are 9,000 years old. So you have to ask, was there a trading network? Were the Iroquois or the Munsee trading directly with the Indians in the Northwest, or were they coming through the mountain Indians and the plain Indians? And then, a lot of different scenarios. But I don't think you can rule any of it out. So, thanks everyone for coming out.